3 years. 3 years since Nora Vance last let anyone past the wrought iron gate at the end of Birchwood Road, without a reason she could verify in writing. 3 years of the same sentence, rehearsed until it came out smooth as Riverstone. I work from home. She watched them nod. She watched them fill the gap with their own explanations. Grief, anxiety, eccentricity, wealth. She watched them stop asking. 4 seconds was all it ever took for her to decide whether a stranger was worth the trouble of a second conversation. Then came the Tuesday in late October, when the pipes under the kitchen floor of her Muskoka property decided to announce themselves. Theo Barker showed up at 8:30 in a company van with a cracked side mirror and a boy of 9 sitting in the passenger seat, eating a breakfast sandwich wrapped in foil. The boy's name was Kit. He had his father's jaw and his late mother's habit of watching everything twice before he decided what to make of it. Theo did not ring the bell the way most people rang it, twice, then a third time for good measure, like punctuation. He rang it once and waited. When Nora's voice came through the intercom, clipped and precise, he said only, "There's standing water under your subfloor. It's been there long enough to matter. I'd like to come in and show you before it gets worse. Not I'm sorry to bother you. Not I can come back if this is a bad time. Just the facts of it, delivered like a man who had learned that extra words did not make bad news easier." Nora buzzed the gate open. The morning had not started well for Theo. He had been halfway through his second coffee when the school called. Supply teacher day. No classroom coverage. Stay home. He set the mug down in the sink without finishing it. Kit was already in the doorway in his socks, reading the situation the way a 9-year-old does when he has spent 2 years learning that his father's silences have different textures. "I can come with you," Kit said. "I won't touch anything." "You can come." Theo agreed. He had 3 jobs on the book that day, and no one to leave the boy with, and no savings elastic enough to absorb a missed morning's work. The hydroelectric contract he'd landed last spring had carried them through the summer, but the autumn had gone thin, and the December bill for Kit's hockey registration was sitting on the counter like a quiet accusation. Kit ate his sandwich in the van as they drove north on Highway 11, the shield rock rising on both sides and the birch trees doing what birch trees do in October, burning white and gold against a sky the color of old pewter. The Vance property was at the end of a gravel road that curved twice before it revealed the house. A converted boathouse expanded over 3 generations into something that should not have worked architecturally and somehow did. Clapboard the color of wet cedar. A porch that wrapped the lakeside entirely. Gardens that had been tended once, recently, and then left to go their own way at the edges. The gate opened before Theo finished his turn in the drive. Inside, the woman was waiting in the main hall. Nora Vance was in her late 40s. Dark hair gone silver at the temples, wearing the kind of plain clothes that cost more than they pretended to. She had the posture of someone who had once held a very large room's attention and had spent the subsequent years deciding she preferred rooms without other people in them. She looked at Kit once, measured, and then looked back at Theo. "I work from home," she said. "I'd appreciate it if this could be completed quickly." The sentence was polished. Theo heard the maintenance in it. The way it headed off sympathy, curiosity, small talk. He had heard his mother use a version of it in the months after his father died, before she found her footing again. He did not answer the sentence directly. He crouched beside the kitchen baseboard where the laminate had begun to cup at the seam and pressed 2 fingers to the floor. Soft. Not catastrophically, not yet, but soft in the way that meant the subfloor beneath was carrying water it hadn't been built for. He tilted his head, ran his palm along the baseboard, and looked up at her. "The pipe isn't the problem right now," he said. "The problem is, whoever caulked this last did it over a gap instead of through it. The water's been sheeting down the inside of the wall for a while. If you let me pull one section of baseboard, I can tell you exactly how long." She looked at him the way she looked at everything, with the patient precision of a woman who had learned to withhold reaction until she understood what was actually being said. Then, "Show me." He showed her. He pulled the baseboard section with a flat bar, careful not to split the paint, and set it aside on the cloth he'd laid down first. Behind it, the wall cavity had a tide line, a faint brown watermark 3 inches from the bottom. He held his phone light to it and explained in the specific, unhurried language of load and moisture and seasonal expansion what had happened and what it meant for the subfloor joists if it continued. Nora crouched down beside him, not hovering, not in the way people crouch when they want to seem engaged. She was actually looking. Kit had drifted to the window that faced the lake, pressed both hands to the glass, was watching 2 loons on the water with the fixed attention of a child who has decided a thing is worth understanding. "Do they stay all winter?" he asked. Nora looked over at him. Whatever she used on adults, the distance, the economy of expression, it didn't apply here. There was no script for a boy asking about loons in good faith. "No," she said. "They leave in November. Those 2 have been here since June." Kit nodded slowly, satisfied in the way children are when a fact arranges itself into a picture they can keep. "Do they come back to the same place?" "The same pair has been on this lake for 11 years. Kit absorbed this. "That's longer than me." Something crossed Nora's face that she hadn't planned for. It was brief, and she recovered quickly, but Theo caught it. The same expression his sister made when she held Kit for the first time after the funeral. The face of someone being reminded that time moves differently for different people, and that this is not always a tragedy. The morning settled into work. Theo moved through the ground floor with a moisture reader and a steno pad, making notes in the shorthand he'd developed over 16 years of trade work. Every 20 feet he found evidence of the same problem in different rooms. A window seal that had been painted over rather than replaced, a door threshold with the weather stripping compressed to nothing, a bathroom exhaust fan vented into the ceiling cavity instead of through the wall. None of it was malice. All of it was the work of a contractor who had done the visible parts well and trusted that no one would ever check the parts that weren't visible. The contractor's name appeared twice in the property file. Nora's property manager had emailed him. Clifton Merrow, estate renovation, 18 months prior, family referral. Theo said nothing about this yet. It was the mechanical room that changed the morning. He opened the utility panel in the basement, a narrow, low-ceilinged room that smelled of old concrete and iron. Because the moisture reader had spiked when he walked past the door, and that kind of spike in a basement was either a sump pump running consistently or something it shouldn't be doing at all. He expected condensation on the copper lines. He expected a sump pump that needed its float adjusted. He expected the ordinary small failures of a house that had been closed up too often and checked too rarely. He found something else, the shutoff for the radiant heating system, a gas-fired boiler that ran the in-floor heat for the entire main level, had been partially closed. Not all the way, just enough that under sustained cold, the system would underperform. And in a house with in-floor radiant heat and an older hydronic system, an underperforming boiler on a January night in Muskoka didn't just mean a cold house. It meant pipes in the exterior walls that weren't rated for the temperatures they'd be asked to hold. It meant burst lines. It meant the kind of water damage that gutted a house to the studs and took 18 months to remediate. He turned the valve with 2 fingers. It moved easily. It had been moved recently. The thread showed no oxidation, no resistance. Theo crouched in the mechanical room with his hand on the valve and listened to the boiler cycle and thought for a long moment. A partially closed shutoff didn't mean what a filed brake spring meant. It might be an error. It might be a previous owner's misunderstanding of the system. It might be any number of things that were not deliberate. But the paperwork Nora's manager had sent included the renovation scope, and the scope listed the boiler service as completed by Merrow's crew 8 months prior. And the thread showed no oxidation. And the house had been empty since late August. He sat back and thought about Kit upstairs asking about loons. He thought about the invoice on the counter for Kit's hockey registration. He thought about Clifton Merrow's name on 2 separate line items in the property file. He shut the mechanical room door behind him, climbed the stairs, and found Nora in the glass-walled study at the back of the house where the dock ran out over still water. And he closed the door. "I need to show you something," he said. And I need to ask you a few questions before I do, because I want to understand what I'm looking at before I tell you what I think." She set her pen down and looked at him with the careful attention of someone who had spent a long time distinguishing between people who said important things and people who only sounded like they were about to. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He told her what he'd found. He used the word recently when he described the valve's thread. He used the word specifically when he described the scope. He did not use the word deliberately yet because he wasn't certain, and he was a man who tried not to say things he wasn't certain of. She was quiet for a moment, looking past him at the dock. "Who was on site during the renovation?" she said. "Your contractor, Merrow, his crew, and anyone he subcontracted." "Merrow was my brother-in-law's recommendation." She said it without particular inflection. "He was meant to be restoring this property so I could lease it seasonally. The estimate came in $40,000 under the next bid." Did anyone else have a reason to want the leasing plan disrupted? She looked at him then. Not the measuring look she'd used since he walked in, but something sharper. Something that had been running the calculation quietly for longer than this conversation. "My brother-in-law," she said. "Whitfield." She didn't say anything else for a moment. She turned her chair to face the window and the lake beyond it, and when she spoke again, her voice had the quality of a door being opened into a room that had been closed for some time. "This property belonged to my husband, Cam. He died 3 years ago. The estate was structured so that Whitfield, Cam's brother, acts as co-executor for all properties until they're transferred or leased. If I lease this property, it exits his oversight permanently. If it remains untenanted and deteriorates beyond a certain assessed value, the estate clause allows him to petition for forced sale at below market rate to recover carrying costs." She turned back. He was a groomsman at Merrow's wedding. They went to school together for 6 years. The room went several degrees cooler. "He doesn't want the property leased," Theo said. "He wants it assessed below the threshold. He wants a forced sale, and he wants to be positioned to purchase it himself or through a nominee at that price. This lake frontage is worth 4 times the estate's carrying cost threshold. He's known that since Cam died." Her hand rested flat on the desk. Merrow's quote was low because there was never any intention of completing the work correctly. Theo set his stenopad on the corner of the desk. Through the window, the loons on the lake moved in slow circles that had no urgency in them. "Why haven't you called a lawyer?" "I have a lawyer. I have had a lawyer since the week after the funeral. What I don't have is evidence of interference rather than incompetence." A partially closed valve and shoddy caulking gets Merrow a bad review. It doesn't get Whitfield's name on a document. Her eyes didn't move from his. "I've spent 3 years managing this property from a distance. Managing this estate from a distance. Managing my life from a distance. Because I couldn't find a way to make what I knew into something a room full of people would believe." Theo was quiet. He thought of the timelines. The renovation 8 months ago, the valve showing no oxidation, the scope that listed the boiler service. "Your boiler service," he said. "Is there a signed inspection record?" "There should be. Merrow was required to provide one under the contract. Can you get me the contract and the inspection record tonight?" She looked at him. Not the lawyer's look, not the estate manager's look. Something quieter. Something that was trying to determine whether he was asking because he was curious or because he intended to do something with the answer. "Mr. Barker," she said, "why are you still here? You found a moisture problem and a valve. You could write me an estimate and leave." He thought of Kit upstairs. He thought of the loons. Because he said, "You haven't asked me to fix a pipe. You've been managing something alone for 3 years and you just told me why." There's a difference between a job and a reason to show up. Something in her face that had been wound carefully for a long time shifted by a single degree. It was small. It was real. "Nora," she said. "Theo, the files are in a cabinet in the study," she said. "I'll get them." By the time Kit had eaten a bowl of soup in a kitchen larger than the living room of their house in Huntsville, and had fallen asleep on a tartan sofa in the reading room with a wool throw over him and a field guide to Ontario birds open on his chest, Theo and Nora had the full renovation contract spread across the dining table alongside 3 years of estate correspondence. The boiler inspection record was signed and dated. Merrow's crew, 8 months prior, but the serial number on the record didn't match the serial number on the boiler in the mechanical room. Different unit. The record was for a boiler that wasn't in this house. Theo turned the page twice to make sure he was reading it correctly. He didn't service this boiler, he said. He filed the record for a different unit. Either he copied a record from another job or he had one made. Nora read the numbers herself. If I had submitted this to the estate for closing the renovation, and the property had subsequently failed inspection, the liability would come back on you for accepting a fraudulent inspection record. Theo looked up. He built you an exit and made it look like a door you walked through yourself. She set the paper down flat on the table. Her hands were steady. Her face was steady. The only thing that moved was her eyes, which went briefly somewhere private and then came back. I have a contact, she said. A woman I went to law school with who left practice to work with the Provincial Property Fraud Unit. I haven't called her in 2 years. She'll remember why I have her number. Call her tonight. I intend to. She looked at the file. But if Whitfield learns that Merrow's been caught before the investigation is opened, he'll move the documentation. He's done this before. Not this, but something adjacent with another property, another executor arrangement 15 years ago. Nothing provable. Everything lost. Then we need to move first. She looked at him across the table, the same look she'd used when he had crouched at the baseboard and actually shown her what he meant. What does that look like? He told her. The valve could be restored to proper position and documented. Photographs, time-stamped, with the moisture reading from the floor above as corroborating context. The fraudulent inspection record needed to be in the hands of her contact at the fraud unit before Merrow had any reason to think anyone had looked at it. The estate correspondence, particularly the emails from Whitfield about the leasing timeline and his references to Merrow's quote, needed to go with it. And the valve? That's physical evidence of interference. I can document it properly, make it something a room can understand. He paused. I'm not an investigator. I can't get you anything that doesn't already exist. But I can tell you what the house is saying, and I can put it in language that makes sense to someone who reads building codes for a living. She picked up her phone. She looked at the screen for a moment without dialing. Theo. She said his name the way she'd said the names of things all morning. Carefully, like she wanted to make sure she was using the right word. Why are you saying yes to this? He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. Because my son asked a woman he'd never met about loons, and she answered him like the question mattered. He set his hands flat on the table. That's the kind of thing that tells you what a person's actually like. Something in her shoulders released. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the careful maintenance of her posture changed by a fraction. The way old wood settles when the temperature finally evens out. She dialed. The woman on the other end picked up on the second ring. Her name was Petra Osei, and she had been waiting, she said, for Nora to call for longer than 2 years. The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes and moved quickly, the way conversations move when both people already know the terrain and are only now deciding to cross it together. By the time Kit woke up from his nap and came to the kitchen doorway, blinking and dragging his wool throw, they had a plan that extended past midnight and required Theo to go back to the mechanical room with a camera and a witness. Nora looked at the boy in the doorway. There's leftover soup, she said, and the field guide on the couch is yours to borrow if you want it. Kit looked at the guide on the sofa, looked at his father, looked at Nora. It has loons in it? Chapter 9, she said, with range maps. He went back for the book without another word. They worked until well past midnight. Theo documented the mechanical room with a time-stamped camera, the valve position, the clearance on the thread, the original installation markings that showed what the correct position should have been. He photographed the inspection record serial numbers beside the boilerplate, the discrepancy plain and irrefutable. He wrote his findings in the kind of flat, specific language that building inspectors recognize as professional and courts recognize as legible. Nora worked the correspondence file at the dining table, marking every email from Whitfield in which he had discouraged the leasing plan, questioned the renovation timeline, or referenced Merrow's bid in terms that showed foreknowledge of the scope. She sent the full package, photographs, documentation, correspondence, to Petra Ose's secure line at 11:47 p.m. At some point between 11 and midnight, while Theo was washing the concrete dust from his hands at the kitchen sink, Nora came in from the dining room and pushed a cup of tea across the counter to him without comment. He drank it. He sat on the stool at the island. "You haven't asked," she said, standing at the window with her own cup and looking at the dark water. "Why I've been out here alone." "You haven't asked," he said. "Why I brought my kid to work." She allowed the corner of her mouth to move once. "Cam died in October," she said, still looking at the lake. 3 years ago next week. He was a surgeon. He was the kind of person who made every room better just by being in it. Not loudly, not because he worked at it, just because he was genuinely interested in other people. He had this quality of attention that made you feel like whatever you were saying was the most important thing that had been said all day. She turned the cup in her hands. "The week after the funeral, I came up here to close the property for winter. I meant to stay 4 days. I stayed 6 weeks. And then the 6 weeks became a pattern, and the pattern became a life, and somewhere in there I stopped leaving. Because it was easier," Theo said. "Not a question. Because out here I could still be the person I was when he was alive. In the city I kept running into the person I'd become without him." She turned from the window. "I told myself I was managing the estate. I was managing myself. The estate was an excuse to stay busy." Theo looked at the cup in his own hands. "My wife, Claire, died 14 months after Kit was born." He said it in the same tone he used for factual things, because he had learned that was the kindest way to say it, clearly, without apology, so the other person didn't have to manage their reaction to it as well as the information. Ovarian cancer. Diagnosed at 7 months postpartum, because we didn't catch it during the pregnancy, and then she had a newborn, and we thought the symptoms were exhaustion. He set the cup down. "I had a 10-month-old, and I had to learn how to do everything at once. There's no grace period for it. You just have to be present for the kid, and grief fits into whatever spaces are left." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Kit doesn't seem like a boy who grew up in grief," she said finally. "He grew up in a house where we talked about her." Theo looked at the window. "He knows her voice because I saved the voicemails. He knows what she thought was funny. He knows she hated cold coffee and loved the Tragically Hip and always burned the first pancake on purpose so the pan would be right for the rest." He paused. "The grief is real. It doesn't eat the rest of it." The house held the silence the way good houses do, not emptily, but with a kind of weight that meant something was being understood. "I built this life," Nora said at last, "so that losing him wouldn't be able to reach me anymore. And then I realized I'd built it so that nothing could reach me anymore. And then a 9-year-old asked you about loons." She looked at him. The careful distance she'd maintained since the intercom that morning had not disappeared, but it had changed character, the way a room changes when you open a window that's been painted shut. "He's a remarkable kid," she said. "He's got his mother's ability to ask the right question," Theo said. "I contributed the stubbornness." Nora's expression did something he hadn't seen it do all day. She laughed. One short, unguarded sound, surprised out of her, the kind of laugh that can't be planned. "Go sleep," she said. "Kit's already out. There are 2 rooms in the east wing. I'll wake you before 6. He slept better than he expected to. He woke clean, the way you wake when something that's been unresolved has found a temporary resting place. At 5:40, Nora placed the call to Whitfield. Her voice on the line was not the voice she'd used with Petra Ose. It was quieter, slightly more uncertain. She told him the property had a significant pipe failure. She told him she was concerned about the estate liability. She told him she needed someone who understood the scope of the renovation to walk her through the mechanical systems, because the contractor had stopped returning her calls, and she didn't know who else to ask. She told him she didn't want to escalate to legal counsel before she understood what she was dealing with. She told him, "I just need family right now." Theo listened from the hallway. He watched her maintain the performance for 90 seconds with complete composure, and then she ended the call and sat very still for a moment with the phone on her knee, and then she looked up. "He's coming this afternoon," she said. "He told me not to touch anything until he gets here." "Good. He'll bring marrow. He always brings marrow when he wants to look like he knows what he's talking about. Better." The call from Petra Osi came at 9:30. The fraud unit had flagged 3 additional properties under Whitfield's co-executor arrangements over the past decade. Similar patterns, similar contractors, nothing previously prosecutable because each victim had settled rather than pursue. Nora's documentation was different in kind. It was the first time they had a fraudulent inspection record with a traceable serial number discrepancy and time-stamped photographic evidence of physical interference with a building system. Petra's contact at the RCMP's Financial Crimes Division was briefed by 10. Kit ate toast at the kitchen counter and read Chapter 9 of The Bird Guide and told Nora, without looking up, that loons could dive to 90 meters. "I know," she said. "That's deeper than most people can scuba." He looked up. "Do you have a scuba thing?" "A wetsuit, somewhere in the boathouse. My dad can fix stuff," Kit said, returning to the book. "He fixed the boathouse roof last summer for Mrs. Okonkwo down the road, and she gave us blueberry jam for a month." Nora looked at Theo over Kit's head. Theo looked at the ceiling. Whitfield arrived at 2:15 in a silver SUV that had never seen a gravel road before this one. He was a large man with Cam's height and none of Cam's quality of attention. He moved through the front entrance with the ownership of someone who had decided that his claim on a space was prior to anyone else's and was waiting for the room to confirm it. Merrow came in behind him carrying a contractor's bag he did not need, in the same way that Whitfield did not need the legal pad tucked under his arm. "Nora." Whitfield's voice had warmth engineered into it. "You sounded terrible on the phone. Let's have a look at what Merrow's crew left you to deal with." Nora stood at the end of the hall. She had her hands loose at her sides, and her expression was the one she'd had at the intercom that morning, measured, unrevealing. "Thank you for coming, Whitfield." She looked at Merrow. "Both of you." She walked them to the mechanical room. Theo stayed in the kitchen with Kit, who had graduated to a jigsaw puzzle he'd found in a cabinet and had the good sense not to ask questions. In the mechanical room, Nora showed Whitfield the valve. She showed him the moisture in the subfloor. She asked him, in the careful voice of someone trying to understand, how the boiler inspection could have been completed correctly if the system had been underperforming to this degree. Whitfield started explaining. He talked about seasonal variance. He talked about the age of the system. He talked, with gathering confidence, about the difficulty of maintaining a property that sat empty for months at a time, about the liability risks of a leasing arrangement that had perhaps been premature, about the wisdom of a market assessment before committing to further renovation costs. Merrow said very little. He looked at the valve once, and something passed over his face that was not quite recognition and not quite panic, but lived in the space between them. "The inspection record," Nora said. "I was looking at it last night. Can you walk me through the serial number here?" She held out the document. Whitfield took it. He looked at it. He started to say something about record-keeping practices. "The serial number on that record," Nora said, "corresponds to a boiler in a property on Skeleton Lake that was serviced in the same billing period. My colleague at the Provincial Fraud Unit has already confirmed the discrepancy with the manufacturer's installation registry." She sent the confirmation to the RCMP's Financial Crimes Division this morning. Whitfield looked at the document. Then he looked at Merrow. Then he looked at Nora. The warmth in his voice had gone wherever engineered things go when the conditions they were built for no longer exist. "You need to think very carefully," he said, "about what you're accusing." "I'm not accusing," Nora said. "The RCMP will do that. What I'm doing right now is giving you an accurate account of what has been documented and where that documentation currently sits so that you understand the position you're in before anyone else has to explain it to you." She looked at him with the patience of a woman who had spent 3 years in a house on a lake learning to be very still. "Cam trusted you," she said. It was the only sentence she said that had anything personal in it, and she said it once, without emphasis, and did not repeat it. 2 vehicles came up the gravel road at 3:45. The officers spoke to Whitfield and Merrow in the main hall for 11 minutes. Merrow answered questions. Whitfield asked for his lawyer. Both of them left in the second vehicle. The first vehicle stayed. The investigator, a quiet woman named Fassbender, who wore her credentials in the same undemonstrative way. Theo wore his knowledge of building systems, sat with Nora at the dining table for an hour and documented the full account while Theo made coffee and Kit set the last 40 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, with the focused pleasure of a child who has decided a thing is worth finishing. By 5 o'clock, the lake had gone the color of pewter again, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke from the fire. Theo had lit in the sitting room to take the damp out of the air, and Nora was standing at the window with her hands around a cup and looking at the water the way she'd been looking at it for 3 years, except that something in the quality of the looking was different. Kit appeared at her elbow. "The loons are still out," he said. "They are. Do you think they know each other well enough that they don't have to talk all the time?" Nora looked at the 2 birds on the water moving in their slow, coordinated circles. "I think that's exactly what 11 years looks like," she said. Kit thought about this. "My dad doesn't talk all the time either, but you can tell he's paying attention." Nora looked across the kitchen at Theo, who was washing 2 cups at the sink and had clearly heard every word and was not going to acknowledge it. She looked back at Kit. "Yes," she said, "you can." The weeks that followed were not quiet, but they were productive in the way that things are productive when the obstruction has finally been cleared. Petra Ossi's unit opened a formal investigation that expanded to include the 3 previous properties. Whitfield's co-executor authority was suspended pending the proceeding. The estate, for the first time in 3 years, was subject to an independent review that had nothing to do with his interests. Nora's property manager retained Theo to complete the renovation work that Merrow's crew had left unfinished. The list was not short. The work was not glamorous. It was the kind of careful, methodical repair that a house needs when it has been used against itself. Reseating the caulk, replacing the weather stripping, routing the bathroom exhaust through the wall instead of into the ceiling, correcting the boiler settings and documenting every change. It took 6 weeks. Kit came twice more, both times because the school day was disrupted and there was nowhere else to be, and both times he brought the bird guide back and reported to Nora on what he'd read since the last visit. On the second visit, she took him to the boathouse and showed him the canoe. On the third, he asked if loons minded being watched from a canoe if you went slowly. "They mind being chased," she said. "They don't mind being accompanied." Theo, who was replacing a section of dock decking 20 feet away, heard this and said nothing, and drove the next nail with a steadiness that had nothing to do with carpentry. In late November, the loons left. Kit stood on the dock in his winter jacket and watched them go. The long run across the water, the moment of lift, the shape of them receding south until the sky closed around where they'd been. "They'll come back," he said. "Not a question." In April, Nora said. She was standing at the end of the dock beside him, to the same bay. "Same pair." "How do you know it's the same pair?" "Because I've been watching them for 11 years. Kit looked at her with the directness children use when they have understood something that adults tend to obscure. "You must have really liked it here," he said, even before. "I did," she said. "I'd forgotten that part." The renovation was officially signed off in the first week of December. Theo filed the final inspection, a legitimate one, with the correct serial numbers and his own name on the document, and submitted the completion report to the estate. The property cleared its assessed threshold with room to spare. The leasing plan moved forward. Nora did not return to the city. She had decided, sometime in the middle of the 6 weeks, that what she had told herself was exile had always been home, and that the difference was not the address but the door. Whether it was a fortress gate or a gate she could open from the inside. She did not summon Theo to discuss any of this. She drove to Huntsville on a Tuesday afternoon in a car she had not driven in 3 years. and she sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee in a mug that had a chip in the handle. And she told him she wanted him on retainer for every Vance property in Ontario. Not just the maintenance work, the proper work, accessibility, winterization, the kind of structural attention that meant a house could hold people and weather without apology. And tell Kit, she said, on the way to the door, that the canoe is in the water as of April. Kit, who had been listening from the hallway because he had his mother's instinct for knowing when something important was happening, came around the corner with the bird guide under his arm. "Can we bring a thermos?" he said. "You can bring whatever you like," Nora said. "It's a long paddle to the North Bay." The last morning of that year that the three of them spent on the water was still and cold and gray in the way that Muskoka is gray in late April. Not bleakly, but quietly, with the kind of patience that has earned the right to take its time. The canoe moved without urgency. Kit sat in the bow with the guide open on his knees, reading the call descriptions and then looking up to see if the water confirmed them. Theo sat in the stern. Nora sat in the middle with her paddle resting across the gunwales, watching the far shore where the birch trees were just beginning to open their leaves. From the North Bay, one long call rolled out across the water. Kit looked up. He did not say anything. He listened to it finish. And then he looked back at the guide. And then he looked at his father. And then he looked at Nora. And his face had the expression of someone who has just found a thing exactly where they were told it would be. He folded the book closed and set his paddle back in the water. The canoe moved on. The lake was very wide and the morning had a long way still to go.